Emily stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, scrubbing a wineglass that had already been cleaned twice. The faint hum of the dishwasher filled the room, but her mind buzzed louder. She glanced at the clock. 10:17 p.m. Mark was late again. The back door creaked, and she froze, her knuckles whitening around the glass. Mark entered, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he loosened his tie. The scent of whiskey clung to him, and his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "You're up," he said casually, tossing his keys on the counter. "I couldn't sleep." Emily set the glass down, drying her hands with deliberate slowness. "You said you'd be home by 9. Mark smirked. "You know how work is." Lately, that was his answer to everything. Emily leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "We need to talk." "About?" He poured himself another drink, the sound of ice cracking against the glass like static in the air. "About us." Her voice faltered, but she steadied it. "You've been different. Distant. And she hesitated. "I found those websites." Mark's eyes flicked up sharply. "What websites?" "You know which ones." She pushed off the counter and stepped closer. "The ones about sharing. About watching." His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he sipped his drink, letting the tension stretch. Finally, he set the glass down. "You shouldn't have been snooping." "Snooping?" Her voice cracked. "Mark, you left them open on your laptop. Do you think I wouldn't see?" "Maybe I wanted you to see." He stepped closer now, his presence overwhelming. "Maybe it's something I thought we could explore, together." Emily's breath hitched. The suggestion hung between them, heavy and suffocating. She searched his face for remorse, for any sign that this was some twisted joke, but all she saw was certainty. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "I'm completely serious." His voice softened, but the confidence remained. "We've been stuck in this rut for months, Emily. The spark is gone. I see it, and you feel it too. But this could bring us back." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "You're talking about using me. Letting strangers." "No," Mark cupped her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I'm talking about freedom. About breaking barriers we didn't even know were there. I love you, Em. But we need this. I need this." His words felt rehearsed, polished, and that scared her more than the idea itself. She pulled away, pacing to the other side of the kitchen. "And what about what I need?" Mark followed, his voice lowering as if he were afraid the walls might hear. "You need to feel wanted again. I see how you look at yourself in the mirror. How you pull away from me. I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to do this for us." The room spun. She pressed her palms against the cool granite countertop to steady herself. Was he right? Had she become so disconnected that this insanity, was the only way to fix them? "I can't give you an answer," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to, not tonight." Mark stepped back, letting the weight of his proposal settle. "But think about it. Really think about it." He left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hall until the bedroom door clicked shut. Emily stood alone, her reflection faintly visible in the glass of the darkened window. The words he'd spoken lingered like smoke, impossible to ignore. Was this desperation or desire? Betrayal or salvation? Emily didn't know anymore. But as she stared at her reflection, her wide eyes, flushed cheeks, and trembling lips, she realized something unsettling. A part of her was curious. Emily sat at the edge of the bed, her phone clenched tightly in her hand. The soft glow of the screen illuminated her face as she stared at the text Mark had sent minutes earlier. "They're coming tonight. Be ready." Her stomach twisted. The words felt cold, transactional, like she was being prepped for a performance she hadn't rehearsed. She glanced toward the bathroom, where Mark's muffled voice echoed as he showered. He was calm. Too calm. Emily wasn't. Her reflection in the vanity mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. Her dark hair fell in soft waves, a deliberate effort to look effortless. The lace-trimmed dress Mark had chosen clung in all the ways she hated, revealing curves she'd spent years trying to downplay. She hated that she had let him choose her outfit. The thought of undressing under the eyes of strangers sent panic flaring through her chest. She squeezed the phone tighter. Was it too late to call it off? To run? The bathroom door opened, and Mark stepped out, a towel slung low on his hips. He smiled when he saw her. You look perfect. I feel ridiculous, she snapped, immediately regretting the sharpness in her voice. But Mark didn't flinch. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. You're beautiful, Emily. His tone softened, but his grip was firm. You're everything I want. I just want you to feel it, too. She looked away, ashamed of the tears pricking her eyes. And if I don't? What happens then? Mark tilted her chin back toward him. Then we stop. No pressure, no judgment. But you have to give it a chance first. She wanted to believe him. Needed to. Trust me, he added. Emily closed her eyes and nodded. She had trusted him once, enough to marry him, to share a life. Couldn't she trust him again, just this once? The sound of the doorbell jolted her back to reality. They're early. Mark stood, smoothing his shirt as if this were any ordinary evening. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Give me a minute. He hesitated but eventually left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Emily sat frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears. The voices that drifted from the living room were deep and unfamiliar. Laughter rumbled through the walls like distant thunder. She forced herself to stand. One step. Then another. When she finally entered the living room, all eyes turned to her. 3 men. Damon was the first she noticed. Tall, broad-shouldered and dark-skinned, with sharp eyes that lingered a little too long. He leaned back in the leather chair, exuding an authority that made her throat tighten. Caleb sat on the couch, his easy smile and relaxed posture almost disarming. Almost. But the way he looked her up and down made her feel more exposed than the dress. And then there was Andre, silent, standing by the window. He said nothing, but his gaze followed her like a shadow, unreadable and intense. Mark stepped forward, his hand resting on the small of her back. This is Emily. Damon rose first, his presence overwhelming as he extended his hand. Nice to meet you. Emily hesitated, then shook his hand, her palm damp against his. Caleb's handshake followed, firmer, more confident, and then Andre's, cool and brief. Mark poured drinks, and the conversation started casually. Too casually. Emily tried to focus, but the words blurred. She caught snippets of compliments, her dress, her hair, her smile, but it felt rehearsed, artificial. Damon leaned closer. You nervous? She blinked. A little. He smirked. Don't be. We're not here to hurt you. The words were meant to reassure, but they only deepened the pit in her stomach. She glanced at Mark, searching for some kind of lifeline, but he was busy pouring another drink, laughing at something Caleb said. She felt untethered. Andre's voice cut through the noise. You can still say no. It was the first time he'd spoken, and it sent a shiver through her. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the room faded. But then Mark's hand was on her arm again, gently guiding her to the couch. You don't have to decide now, Mark said softly, brushing her hair back. Let's just enjoy tonight. No expectations. Emily swallowed hard. The weight of their stares pressed against her skin, but she managed a small nod. The evening was far from over, but Emily already knew, there was no going back. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her knees pressed tightly together. The glass of wine Mark had handed her earlier felt heavy in her hand, untouched. The room pulsed with tension, too much laughter, too many sidelong glances. She could feel their eyes grazing over her, measuring, assessing. Damon leaned back in his chair, his broad frame dominating the space. So Emily, he began, his voice low and deliberate. How did Mark convince you to do this? The question hit like a slap. She forced a tight smile, her fingers trembling against the wineglass stem. He didn't convince me, she said, her voice softer than she intended. We talked about it. Together. Damon's lips curled, not quite a smirk but close. Together. He glanced at Mark. That's rare. Mark laughed lightly, but Emily caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. It vanished quickly, replaced by the same confident mask he always wore. Emily's braver than she gives herself credit for, Mark said, placing his hand on her thigh. The touch sent a jolt through her, not because it was affectionate, but because it felt like a signal. A cue. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're nervous. It wasn't a question. Emily swallowed. I'm fine. Good, Caleb said, his smile widening. Because you're stunning. And honestly, I can't stop looking at you. Her cheeks burned. She glanced at Mark, expecting, hoping for him to step in, to defend her. But he just smiled, taking another sip of his drink like this was the most natural thing in the world. Andre, who had remained mostly silent, finally spoke. We can stop if it's too much. The room stilled. Emily met his eyes and found something she didn't expect. Concern. Genuine or rehearsed, she couldn't tell, but it was enough to make her pulse slow. Mark's hand tightened on her leg. She's fine, he said sharply. No, Emily's voice surprised even herself. She pulled away from Mark's grip, setting her wineglass on the table with a clink. I'm not fine. For the first time that night, all three men fell silent. Even Mark's easy confidence faltered. Emily stood, wrapping her arms around herself. This is too much. She turned to Mark. You said no pressure, no expectations. Mark stood too, reaching for her arm. Emily. No, she stepped back. You don't get to push me into this and pretend it's for us. It's for you, Mark. All of this is for you. The words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Damon stood next, his size even more imposing now. We should go. Mark's jaw clenched, but he nodded, stepping aside as the men moved toward the door. Caleb lingered for a moment, his eyes filled with something that might have been disappointment, or relief. Andre didn't say anything, but before he left, he gave Emily one last look. And then they were gone. Mark shut the door, the sound echoing through the suddenly too quiet room. Emily's shoulders slumped, the weight of the night pressing down all at once. What the hell was that? Mark snapped. Emily spun around. What was it? You tell me. Her voice broke. Because it wasn't about fixing us. It was about breaking me. Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing. You're overreacting. No. I'm finally seeing things clearly. He stopped, turning to face her. You agreed to this. I agreed because I wanted to believe you. I wanted to believe this was about saving our marriage. But it's not. It's about control. And I won't let you do this to me. For the first time, Mark had no response. Emily didn't wait for one. She turned and walked down the hall, her steps echoing louder than they should have. Her hand trembled as she reached for the bedroom door, but she didn't hesitate. She closed it behind her, leaning against it as tears finally fell. Was this the end? Or just the beginning of something far more dangerous? Emily didn't know. But as the silence pressed in, she realized she couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore.